Hi, welcome back to the podcast, HOA Hell. I'm your host, Michael Kushner, and with me as always is Senior Associate from MBK Chapman, Sam Kill. Sam, hi.
Morning, Mike. Good to be with you.
Glad you're here. Sam, today we're going to talk about something that is ubiquitous. It is now, more often than not, I see this, and I see kids riding these in a way that, of course, when I was growing up, it was unheard of because they didn't exist. When I was growing up, when we rode bikes, we had to pedal. We had to ride everywhere. It was on our power. Now, the vast majority of when I say kids, I mean 13 and up, right? I'm talking about teenagers, seem to be riding the e-bikes, okay? Battery-assisted e-bikes or e-scooters. So today we're going to talk about e-bikes and e-scooters. We're going to focus on what the law is in California, how the law intersects with HOAs, because this is in the news now, and tangential to that, we're going to talk about a very tragic scenario that has happened right here in our own backyard. As you know, our main office for MBK Chapman is located in South Orange County in the city of Aliso Viejo. And there is actually a very tragic incident that occurred just a couple of months ago in Aliso Viejo that has made the news nationwide and certainly has made the news locally as well. But it is an important aspect of what we're going to be talking about today. So e-bikes, e-scooters, if you have a teenager or if your teenager has one of these and you live in an HOA, or in fact, for one of the first times ever, even if you don't live in an HOA, this episode is for you because we're actually going to be talking about the law, which has nothing to do with HOAs, okay? Now, these devices are everywhere now, e-bikes, e-scooters, okay? Now, I will say this. We're also going to be talking briefly about e-motorcycles. E-motorcycles and e-bikes are not the same thing, and I will differentiate them later, okay? But today's focus is the law on the use of those e-bikes and e-scooters, and then the intersection with HOA law and what that means for homeowners and parents, because this is really an important episode for both, okay? So let's start with the law, okay? What are e-bikes? An e-bike is a bicycle, okay? It's a bike. It's got pedals and everything. Pedals have to be operational. And it has a motor. Of course, it's an electric motor. It's not a combustion. It doesn't run on gasoline, right? So it's not an internal combustion engine. And it has a motor that is no greater than 750 watts, okay? And it's governed by vehicle code, not civil code. Vehicle code 312.5, and e-bikes are divided into three classes, and the devil's in this detail. The three classes, okay? So just to reiterate, it is a bike like any other. It's got pedals and everything, but it also has an electric motor of up to 750 watts, okay? And it falls into three classes. I want you to tell me the first two. I'll handle the third.
Okay. Under 312.5, E-Class 1 constitutes e-bikes that have assisted pedaling up to 20 miles an hour.
What does that mean in terms of, let's say I stop pedaling on a Class 1. What happens?
So on a Class 1, once you stop pedaling, the motor does not take over.
It disengages.
It disengages. Right. Okay, so it's assisted up to 20 miles an hour, and that's where it's capped.
But you've got to pedal.
Exactly.
Okay, good one. Class 2.
Class 2 is a bit different in that you have unassisted, motorized functionality up to 20 miles an hour. And beyond that, it's pedaling. And if you exceed 20 miles an hour,
that's
basically you better pedal and be able and capable of doing so.
If you, because these are kind of heavy, right? If you can get over 20 miles an hour, it's unassisted because you're using your leg power. You're using your lungs and your muscles to get there, okay? So that's good. That's the first two classes. And there's no age limit on Class 1 or Class 2, okay? Now, what's important here, and we're going to talk about all aspects of this, is those Class 1 and Class 2, those are both e-bikes, but they're different in terms of how they work. In that Class 1, it's only pedal assisted up to 20. Class 2, you could literally not pedal at all and still go 20. That's the difference between Class 1 and Class 2. That's really it, okay? Now, we're talking about manufactured limits here. We are going to mention later that there are ways, and unfortunately, this is something that kids can do very easily by looking at YouTube.
Yeah.
And I wish there was a way that they couldn't do this, but you can skirt around these manufactured governors on speed, and these things are capable of going faster, and that is a liability for parents, so we'll talk about that later, okay? Now, let me talk about Class 3, because that is a very different scenario. Class 3 is an e-bike, okay? It's an assist only while pedaling, so it's more like a Class 1, but its speed is up to 28 miles per hour, and Class 3 bikes have to have a speedometer, and you have to be 16 or older to ride one. You do not have to have a driver's license, but you must be 16 or older. You can't be 15, 14, 13, or younger. Your class, where your kid, based on age and skill, falls is the entire issue here, is what class are they allowed to ride? Because a parent that allows a 13 or 14-year-old to ride a Class 3 faces more liability and potential criminal liability than a parent who allows their 12 or 13-year-old to ride a Class 1 or 2. Now, of course, parents are always responsible for the negligence of their children, regardless of whether or not there's a violation of the law occurring. But your negligence or your potential liability goes up when you have allowed your child to ride a bike that they are not legally allowed to ride. Now, let's talk about, so that's e-bikes, 3 classes, e-bikes, and under manufacturing limiters, the top speed is 28 for the Class 3 and 20 for the 1 and 2. What's an e-scooter? That's a totally different thing. And they come in a variety of ways. You can classify an e-scooter, I think probably as a Segway would be an e-scooter, as would a normal scooter that kids, propel with their leg, but they don't have to. They could use a electronic gas pedal. That's governed by Vehicle Code 407.5, a different code section of the Vehicle Code. I'll explain why in a minute. A e-scooter is defined as a motorized scooter, 2-wheeled device, not 3, 2-wheeled device that has handlebars and an electric motor, but it is very distinct from an e-bike or an e-motorcycle, which we'll talk about in a minute, okay? The e-scooters, again, 2-wheeled, they usually are, the wheels are actually quite small. I've shown a picture on the screen, so you've gotten a look at what I mean by e-scooter, because I showed you one a minute ago on the screen, okay? E-scooters are governed, they're covered under the statute I just mentioned a minute ago, but their operating rules are found in a different Vehicle Code section, 21235, okay? Now, what are those operating rules? 1, a motorized scooter can never be ridden faster than 15 miles an hour, okay? Anywhere, on any road or sidewalk or walkway, no matter what the posted limit is. If the posted speed limit is 25 and your scooter is capable of going that fast, you aren't allowed to. It can only go 15. Remember, it has a speedometer, okay? The next thing is the rider has to have, and there's no exceptions to this, the rider has to have a valid driver's license or a permit, the driver's permit, and the scooter has to have working brakes. Now, by definition, your 16-year-old that has a driver's license can ride a scooter, but your 16-year-old who has not yet obtained a driver's permit or license can't. Okay, because you got to have the permit or the license, and of course it has to have brakes. Right. And this is for battery purposes that we'll talk about later, and the increasing risk of really dangerous fires. You cannot lay, and this is in the Vehicle Code again, you can't lay the scooter, you can't park it on its side, like lay it down, or if any part of it is blocking a pathway or a sidewalk. Right. And that seems kind of obvious to me. Yeah. Now, why are e-scooters treated very differently from an e-bike? Remember, in Class 1 and 2 of the e-bike, any age. It's only Class 3 that you have to be 16, no license. A scooter, you have to have a license or a permit. Why? Very simple. When these things came into, so our Vehicle Code existed, long before e-scooters and e-bikes came into being. And although they've been amended, and we'll talk about some of the new laws that kicked in a few months ago, we'll talk about that shortly. The fact is that when these came into being, e-bikes were treated as a traditional bike and retroactively fit into the traditional bike laws. But the e-scooter, since it didn't have a natural analog from the past, was just considered like a motor vehicle. So it was stuck in the motor vehicle section.
Right.
And that's why it's in a different place in the vehicle code. And that's why the rules are stricter. They just are. They're much stricter. It simply comes down to that. It was unlike anything that ever existed.
Pedals versus no pedals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yes. So let's talk about when your kid's e-bike is not even an e-bike, because that is what feeds into this tragic story we're going to tell you. So you have e-bikes and you have e-scooters, and you also have what are called e-motorcycles. It's a motorcycle that just doesn't run an internal combustion engine that you feed with gas. It's an electronic. It's like the Tesla motorcycle, although that doesn't exist, I don't think. Okay? So an e-motorcycle is not a bike. It's not an e-bike, and it's not an e-scooter. It is a motorcycle. And here's where parents get blindsided, okay? Some of the fastest and coolest looking, and I'm putting air quotes here, e-bikes out there that kids want and beg their parents to buy them are not actually e-bikes. They're e-motorcycles, okay? If I'm a parent with a minor, and thank goodness I'm over that stage, but if I was, I would be looking up images on Google of e-motorcycles to see what they look like, because they do look different. And a lot of parents are fooled, either just because they don't know better, why would they, or their kid has convinced them that the thing they want is an e-bike, and it's not, okay?
Yeah.
Look for the pedals, folks.
Right.
Now, I will say this. Some e-bike manufacturers have sold separate kits where people can attach pedals to the e-motorcycle.
Yeah.
That does not work. They tried that before some of these laws were changed, but now that won't work. So if you're a parent, don't fall for that. Looking for pedals is not the only giveaway. You got to look at the wattage and the power, because here's why. Okay? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Let me just say this. I hinted a minute ago that it's very easy to tamper with an e-bike and turn it into not an e-bike anymore.
Right.
There are e-bikes, remember, those motors that allow you to go unassisted or assisted at 20 miles an hour or class 328 are capable of much faster speeds without a limiter. If those limiters are bypassed, either by cutting something or installing something on the bike, and I don't know how to do it. I've never owned one.
Nowadays, they have YouTube videos
That's
to
right.
show you how to do it. Yeah.
And if you're in that situation, your e-bike is no longer an e-bike. It can become an e-motorcycle, regardless of the fact that it started out as an e-bike. So there are e-bikes that were truly e-bikes that are no longer e-bikes. And then there are e-bikes that are e-bikes and always will be.
Right.
And then there are e-motorcycles that never were e-bikes. But if you've got a e-bike that has been tampered with beyond its limitations that came from the manufacturer, you could turn it into an e-motorcycle, and then you got the same potential liabilities, criminal and civil, that an e-motorcycle faces. So again, you as a parent, you have to do your homework. You have to, or you could end up losing your house or going to jail or both. Okay.
And I would go as far as saying keep an eye on them too, because unbeknownst to parents, kids tamper, modify, do conversions
all the time.
There's peer pressure, and these kids are resourceful these days.
And they're kids.
Yeah.
And they're going to do stuff like this. It's your job to police that until your kid's brains fully form 10 years later. Okay. All right. Now, well, fortunately, you're not responsible once they turn 18. So really, it's not even 10 years later. It's till they turn 18. Then they're on their own. But let's start with an e-bike that loses its e-bike status. It's been tampered with to go beyond the posted speeds, the stated speeds. And again, as Sam said, that's easy to do. You can watch a simple video. So again, monitor that. Okay? Now, as of January 1st of this year, so 5 months ago, whatever, okay, it's illegal in California to sell a product or an app that's designed to soup up or change or increase the speed of an e-bike, okay? So the law is limited to an app or a product. It doesn't illegalize making a video on YouTube with instructions. It just means you can't sell products or an app to take care of it for you if it's a computer thing. Again, I have no idea how it's done, so I'm not even sure what's typically done, and I'm not interested in knowing. I've never had an e-bike. I don't want one, okay? But the fact is, it is now illegal to tamper, even if your tampering is minor. Let's say you brought it from 20. Let's say you took a class 1 or 2 and tampered it so it went 30. Okay? It doesn't matter. Still illegal. You still get the same problems. Okay? Now, some e-bikes were never e-bikes to begin with, and that's the e-motorcycle. Take a look at your screen. I'm going to put a picture of an e-motorcycle. This is one of the popular ones, although I did this by AI. So this isn't, I'm not taking anybody's copyright or anything. I actually created this photograph from a real e-bike out there. Okay? Now, a device like the Surron Ultra B, Surron. I'm only singling out this company because they bear heavily in the news story that I'm about to talk about in a minute. Okay? A device like a Surron Ultra B, which goes up to, at least the bike in question went up to 60 miles an hour. Yep. And by the way, if anybody's ever driven in an electric car, it does it very quickly. Okay? They're marketed as off-road e-motorcycles. They are not marketed as e-bikes. They're marketed as e-motorcycles. That's accurate. Okay? And that's what they should be marketed at. So I have nothing against the company for producing a product that is probably a lot of fun to drive. Okay? But these are classified as motor vehicles. E-motorcycles are not e-bikes, okay? So they fall under Vehicle Code 405 and Section 400, okay? Either way, street use demands, if you're riding an e-motorcycle, you have to have a driver's license. Can't have a permit.
Right.
You have to have a motorcycle license, which is not just a Class 3, okay? It used to be called, when I got mine, it was an M1. I got mine back in the 80s. It was called an M1. Now I actually don't know what they're called because mine's grandfather. So you have to have not only a driver's license, but a motorcycle license, meaning you've gone to the DMV and taken the motorcycle test. You've got to have insurance. It's the whole 9 yards. It is a motorcycle just like a Harley is. There's no difference in the vehicle code or on the rules of the road about driving an e-motorcycle and a Harley or a Ninja or any other motorcycle. It's the same thing, same laws. Okay? Obviously, they have to have a registration, a license plate, the whole kit and caboodle, folks, because they can go, some of these go in excess of 60.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I don't know if all of them are freeway legal or not. I don't know enough about that. I just know that they are much faster, much more powerful, and they are treated as a motor vehicle. You're not going to let your 13-year-old take the Volvo to school, to middle school. You shouldn't take the 13-year-old, take the e-motorcycle anywhere. Again, I'll explain why in a minute. Well, let's do it now.
Okay.
Let's talk about it right now.
Let's go for it.
When it comes to Class 3 e-bikes or e-motorcycles, rider has to be 16. When it comes to e-motorcycles, they got to be licensed. And they have to have the motorcycle license and be insured and all that, okay? But it only takes one tragedy to bring people's attention to the problem. And that's what we've got here. So let's talk about what happened to a
14-year-old.
Let's talk about the parties.
Victim,
Let me introduce the parties and you'll tell us the story. This happened in April in Aliso Viejo, California, right around the corner from this office. The rider of the e-motorcycle in question was a 14-year-old boy. The other party is this individual's mother. And then there's the innocent victim who was an 80-year-old Vietnam vet who was in ICU critically injured for a long time and has recently died. So that person was killed as a direct result of this tragedy. Tell me about what happened that day.
Well,
and before. Give me the story.
Yeah. Well. In short, for our purposes, we were dealing with this 14-year-old boy who had previously been reprimanded and cited for driving recklessly. The mother was informed of this.
There's a video of like a 20 or 30-minute conversation with the cops where they're telling her,
exactly,
this is a motorcycle, your kid's not legal.
Weeks before this sad incident and tragedy. And so the mom was absolutely on notice in terms of the illegality of it, of the recklessness of
Allegedly.
Exactly. It's still
pending.
Pending and under investigation. And so that really imparted a heightened scrutiny in terms of the liability, responsibility from the parent for this minors, actions and omissions, and sadly, the rest of it you laid it out at the outset. Led to
No,
this.
I didn't give the details.
Well, this incident where this guy was doing basically a bunch of
Wheelies
and maneuvers, as kids would do with these types of bikes or skateboards, to kind of draw an analogy. And there was a collision.
He was on the street doing wheelies.
Right. And he basically collided with this elderly gentleman, this veteran, rest in peace. And
Pedestrian,
unfortunately, and put him in the hospital, and he suffered from, without getting to the clinical side of it, I believe some serious internal bleeding
And he died.
other trauma, and he passed away.
Okay, so bottom line, this individual was hit by the 14-year-old kid who was doing tricks, wheelies on his e-motorcycle, which had a speed of up to 60 miles, and it was that Saron Ultra B that I referenced earlier. That's the bike that the kid was riding. The mother had been on prior notice from the police, and this is on recorded tape, of the fact that this was a motorcycle that required a license, 16 years old, all that. So, and these are based on the press release that the Orange County District Attorney released, and Todd Spitzer was speaking about publicly. Yeah. And a minute ago, I had that up on the screen. I'll make that available in the description, as well as the link to my fact sheet that I wrote about this tragedy. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But this man recently died as a result of the injuries sustained that day. Now, here's what the tragedy is. Aside from the fact that we have an innocent loss of life, aside from the fact that this 14-year-old boy is going to have to live with this for the rest of his life, that he killed someone, his mother is being charged criminally for at least 2 felonies. One, reckless endangerment of a minor, her son, and after the fact, or accessory after the fact, for, I guess, manslaughter at this point since the guy died. I'm not quite sure whether it's going to be accessory after the fact for manslaughter or what that charge is, but they're both felonies. She's looking at least, and this was before the guy died, it was 6 years in prison. I don't know if that's changed, but she is being prosecuted. And the district attorney in Orange County, Todd Spitzer, has made it clear that he is going to he'll prosecute other parents.
He'll be aggressive, yeah.
That are guilty of the same sort of crime. And what we don't know, and we can't know right now, is how aggressive is this going to be? For example, if a 14-year-old is riding a Class 3 e-bike and doesn't modify its speed, but isn't 16 and gets in an accident, is the parent going to be criminally charged? If there's been no proof that the parent had any prior notice, are they going to get charged? We don't know. But it sure is scary, folks. I'm setting aside for a minute the civil liability because that's big enough. I'll talk about that in a sec. I'm only talking right now about the potential criminal liability. This mother, if she's convicted, could go to prison for years. That means that she will not be there during her son's more formative teenage years. And this son is going to be without a mother for this period of time that she's locked up if she's convicted. That is a tragedy by itself. We have just tragedy upon tragedy in this story. It's horrible. Okay? The district attorneys basically said, look, my hands are tied here. If parents are going to give their kids a loaded weapon, I've got to act. And these e-motorcycles, for example, in this case, in the hands of a 14-year-old is a loaded weapon. Okay? Now, that tragedy aside, let's talk for a second about the civil liability, because this can attach even if a parent and the kid are following the law. You have a 13-year-old using a Class 1, hasn't been modified within the law, they're being negligent by doing wheelies and they run into somebody. That goes without saying. The parents are going to be liable for the actions of their minor child, and that's going to, on civil liability, injuries, medical pain and suffering, it could be, you could lose your house. If your home insurance won't cover that for whatever reason, or you don't have that sort of insurance, or you don't have enough insurance, you could be in a lot of trouble. So just on a civil basis alone, setting aside loss of life, tragedy, and all that, just financially, it can devastate you. It behooves you parents, watch your kids, take an interest. But let's talk for a minute about how the e-bikes and e-motorcycles aren't the only danger point. There's also a new law, and this is Vehicle Code 21212. So think of New York area code and then add a 12 on the end of it. And that is the new helmet law, which comes with e-scooters and or e-bikes. And that is, it makes the parent or guardian jointly and severally liable for any fine issued against an under 18 rider who isn't wearing a helmet. Because the law says that every rider that is under 18 must have a helmet on for any of these devices. So if your kid, 14 years old, is riding a Class 1 bike, otherwise being careful but not wearing a helmet, the kid's going to get a ticket, and you're going to get the ticket as well because you're jointly and severally liable with your child for the fine incurred, okay, on that helmet law. Now, that does not require, for Class 1 and 2, it doesn't require an adult to wear a helmet. No. It only applies to 18 and under, okay? And it only covers e-bike and e-scooters, or I think actually we're just talking about e-bicycles right now, okay? E-motorcycles would fit under the vehicle code requirements for a motorcycle helmet. And that's not a bike helmet. It's a different kind of helmet, okay? Now, 21213, the very next statute, okay, requires every Class 3 rider to wear a helmet regardless of their age. So Class 1 and 2 e-bikes, if you're over 18, you don't have to wear a helmet. If you're under 18, you do, and you, the parent, are liable with your kid for any fine. If you are riding a Class 3, everybody, adult or child, must wear a helmet, okay? And I guess the through line on this is simple, okay? If your child rides, they have to wear a helmet, and if they don't, you're responsible, even if no accident occurs, okay? Now, let's talk about HOAs at intersections.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of HOAs are passing rules about e-bikes.
Yeah.
Now, we've done multiple episodes, you and I, Sam, on how a rule gets passed, how a rule is judged legal or enforceable or not legal or not enforceable.
Correct.
And we know that the number one thing set forth in the Davis-Sterling Act on assuming that the governing documents give rulemaking powers to the HOA, which they almost all do.
Exactly.
What is the number one rule about a rule? It's got to be what?
It has to be reasonable.
Right. So, for example, an HOA, I could totally see passing a ban on riding an e-bike or e-scooter on a sidewalk. Because that's where pedestrians are, and there's a greater degree of injury because of the speed.
Exactly.
And not only the speed, meaning you get run into somebody much more quickly, but the injury that occurs is much more because you're moving the mass at a much higher speed, right?
Yeah.
And so I could see that passing, and that's completely reasonable. Right?
Agreed, 100%.
I can see a rule being passed and upheld as completely reasonable, saying no child under 16 may ride a Class 3 e-bike in our community because it's mirroring the law. In other words, you can't violate the law in our community.
Yeah.
If it's reasonable for the law, it's reasonable for an HOA to pass a rule on it. So they could pass a rule on the helmet thing. If you're riding Class 3, no matter who you are, you got to wear a helmet.
Yeah.
If you're riding a 1 and 2 and you're a child, you got to wear a helmet. I don't know whether an HOA would get away with forcing an adult riding a Class 1 and 2 to wear a helmet. That, I don't see a nexus there between an HOA's.
Probably not. The only reason I can think of possibly as far as reasonableness on their part is insurance.
Common area.
If on their premises, on common area,
you might be right.
injury ensues, it impacts the HOA and its interests. So
you might be right. And if that's the case, under that scenario, he might actually be right, and I might need to reform my opinion on that. That's a good point. I didn't think of that. Okay. So to the extent that you're riding in common area, an HOA might say, okay, even though the law doesn't require it, we require everybody to wear a helmet because we don't want to have additional insurance liability if you get hurt and your brain splatter on a common area. By the way, speaking of common area, if your HOA wants to ban riding in certain common areas because of the crowding or the nature of the makeup, they can probably do that very easily. Exactly. They can certainly require that you ride the speed limit. For example, we talked about Class 1 and 2 going up to 20, Class 3 going up to 28. My HOA, for example, has a speed limit of 17 for some reason in the community. So even though every e-bike out there, by definition, goes faster than 17, the HOA is well within its legal rights to pass a rule saying e-bikes have to follow the speed limit, and therefore they can only go 17 as well, just like a car. That's going to pass no matter. That's not going to be a challengeable rule, right? There's going to be no riding zones. Like we just said, they could do that. Let's talk about batteries for a sec.
Okay.
What is and this has been in the news a lot. In fact, we're going to talk about a new law in a second that just went into effect related to e-bike and e-scooter batteries. And what are they? They're lithium batteries, right?
They're lithium batteries. I mean,
and what are they prone to do once in a while, especially if they're not made well or they're not certified? Like
they catch on fire, and they are They can be extremely dangerous, and especially when you have in community style living, stacked living, connected living, in condominiums, townhomes.
Yeah.
It's especially pressing and imminent in terms
because of the
fire insurance, the fact that fires can spread easily to adjacent
to the
homes.
next wall. Right now, you just burned up 5 people's homes.
And not to connect too many dots here, but also enhanced liabilities for parents by virtue of those things.
Right, but let's talk about a lithium battery that is from a cheap manufacturer that hasn't followed proper guidelines, hasn't followed proper standards. Has a very high danger of fire. And the problem is that those fires burn much, much hotter than regular fires. And you can't put water on these fires. You cannot, and most people don't know that. You cannot put out a lithium fire with water.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's troubling.
It's a very troubling situation. Yeah. As a result, a lot of HOAs have passed rules restricting where people can charge their batteries. Mm-hmm. A lot of HOAs in California, for example, have passed rules saying that nobody's allowed to charge if you live in a condo or townhome. They can't charge inside their unit. Mm-hmm. Okay? Those are going to be enforceable. Absolutely going to be enforceable. Okay? Now let's talk about that lithium battery and these rules for a second, a little bit more, okay? There's a 2025 law that went into effect about these batteries, and it's Vehicle Code 312.5. So that went into effect almost a year and a half ago, okay? And it stated that every new e-bike, not old ones, and there are thousands and thousands of old ones, just the ones sold from January 1st, 2025 on. Mm-hmm. Any e-bike sold after that date, the battery had to meet a recognized set of standards for safety and certification to avoid the cheap knockoff batteries that didn't follow proper standards, because those fires were becoming common. I know personally an individual whose $1.5 million house burned down on Ladera Ranch as a result of the lithium battery on the person's scooter. Okay? I know this person personally. Ended up moving to Idaho and staying there. Okay? That was a nightmare. Thankfully, nobody got hurt. But these charging restrictions that these HOAs are passing are on solid ground. Nobody's going to successfully challenge those. But let's talk about city streets. Mm-hmm. Okay? We've had an HOA try to ban any use of any e-bike or e-scooter anywhere in the HOA community. That's not reasonable for one reason only. You have to allow homeowners to have ingress and egress from their houses.
Exactly.
If a person uses an e-bike or an e-scooter or an e-motorcycle as their primary means of transportation, which some people do because it is better for the environment than gasoline, okay? If somebody's doing that, you can't expect them to walk it out. If they're living like a huge HOA community like Kodo, for example, you can't expect them to walk 2, 3, 4 miles to get out of the neighborhood. That's absurd. Mm-hmm. That won't fly. Okay? If your HOA does not have private streets and they're city-owned streets, and they don't have either the contract or a permit from the city to manage those streets, they can't pass rules anyway regarding use of a city-owned or city-managed street.
Substantially weakens their position.
It does. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So any rule which completely bans any use at all of those e-bikes or e-scooters is not going to be reasonable. Mm-hmm. Okay, because you got to give people ingress and egress. Right. They have to have a means of getting in and out. Mm-hmm. You can ban, like I said, you can have no-fly zones. You can have those, but you got to give them a way to get from point A to point B.
Exactly.
Point B being exiting the community.
Right.
Now, one HOA in particular, and this is kind of our last section before we close. One HOA in particular has run afoul, and that's what prompted this story. In addition to the tragedy in Aliso Viejo, which we were aware of, but it didn't spur me right at the time. But when I saw this next thing, that together with the tragedy brought me to do this episode. And that is, we got from a listener a copy of a flyer that was recently distributed by his HOA, and it's I'm going to name the HOA, Harlan Ranch. Okay, I think it's near Clovis or something. Yeah, it's out there. It's out in the boonies, I think. But Harlan Ranch HOA. And this newsletter did a lot of things, or had a lot of really bad, wrong things on there that violate not only either state law and or more specifically, the Davis-Sterling Act. Number one, it issued a what? What kind of fine did it issue?
It was a $200 fine. It was a
flat rate fine.
Flat rate fine, yeah.
$200 fine for violating any of their
e-bike rules that they implemented.
Right.
Yep.
Any of their e-bike or e-scooter rules, it meant is a $200 fine. It implied there would be no hearing, but you couldn't get that for sure.
It wasn't quite clear. Yeah.
And I put that briefly on the if you're watching this, I briefly put a graphic up of the newsletter that we're talking about to show you that it really was a newsletter. It's a 2-page letter, and I put both pages up for a second. So you can always rewind or stop it and take a look for yourself. But that violates a bunch of things right there. Number one, anybody that's followed our podcast knows that AB 130.
Yeah. Caps fines at $100.
Yeah.
Unless an exception applies.
Caps at $100, all fines. Now, there is an exception. It's the health and safety exception. And by the way, this would fall under that easily. Except what's the prerequisite in the law now? In order for an HOA to say we're going to fine $200 for this after a hearing, what do they have to do first?
The HOA board has to deliberate on the heightened and imminent health and safety concern. They have to pass and adopt a resolution, and that has to be shared with the membership.
At the open meeting.
Correct.
Exactly. That has to happen first. So they can say, for health and safety reasons associated with X, studies have shown, blah, 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 injuries are shown, fires are da-da-da. They're going to be able to establish that. There's a lot of dangers on these e-bikes and e-scooters. They can do that. But before that rule, that increased fine beyond the $100 cap, and AB 130 is, at least this part of AB 130 was codified in Civil Code 5850, right? So before an HOA can do that, they have to, on the record, as Sam just said, present the finding of the health and safety, the nature of the health and safety concern, and it's got to be in the minutes, right? They have to do that first. They can't just announce that. So between them not telling us whether or not this was going to be after a hearing, implying that it could be just automatically assessed,
right?
And it looks like they violated the AB 130 cap set out in 5850 because it didn't mention anything. Now that we have made a finding of this and that, we are going to increase the fines for health and safety reasons. Right. They didn't say any of that in the newsletter. They just said $200 fine.
Yeah, exactly.
That is illegal, okay? Now, we don't have information as to whether or not that was just sloppy writing, and they did do that. We don't know that yet. We weren't retained. It was just a listener sending us this. If this listener hires us, we'll take a look at that, okay? So it could be that they did comply, but it doesn't look like it if you look at the flyer.
Right.
It is very strongly implied that they didn't comply. Now, I want to make one thing clear before we close out, okay? Oh, by the way, this newsletter also did one more thing. It was one of the ones that banned any use of an e-bike or scooter anywhere in the neighborhood at all. That rule, even if everything else was done right, will not pass the smell test, in my opinion. I think I would be willing to litigate that and take it to trial. I don't think they'd win that, okay? Now, let's kind of close out here. How do you tell if your HOA is following the law or if their HOA rule regarding e-bikes and e-scooters are legal? Okay. First off, identify which device you or your child has. Is it a class 1, class 2, or 3? Is it an e-scooter or is it an e-motorcycle? We gave you what the laws were for each of these earlier. You can refer back or take a look at the article or the fact sheet that I have the link to in the description. Okay. Once you've identified the device, look at the rule and see if it caters to one of those classes. Do the governing documents give the HOA authority to pass that kind of rule? Most do, so that'll be a slam dunk. Is the rule reasonable?
Yeah.
Objectively reasonable? We gave you examples of several rules that HOAs are passing that would be, and we've given you some examples of ones that aren't. Okay? Pin down whether or not the street in your HOA is owned by the city or is owned by the HOA, or if owned by the city, whether the HOA actually has a permit or some contract with the city that it can regulate use by its members. If you're fined more than $100, make sure 5850 was followed so that AB 130 is being complied with. Folks, e-bikes and e-scooters and e-motorcycles are here to stay. They're fun, but they're very dangerous for the most part because kids are riding these. You don't see kids riding Harleys all the time, 13-year-olds riding Harleys around. But you see kids on e-bikes, e-scooters, and other things when you know it's not legal for them. Now, at least you know now. That's where the danger lies. And for parents, it lies in terms of financial liability and potential criminal liability. And also the potential, just the moral issues involved. What's your kid, no parent wants their kid to live with the guilt associated with killing somebody by mistake. That 14-year-old, that poor 14-year-old is going to have this on their conscience forever. And that's a tragedy right by itself. Never mind what the family of the old man is going through as well. Yeah. Okay? Mm-hmm. E-bikes and e-scooters are here to stay. HOAs are trying to deal with it just like cities, counties, and the state is. Mm-hmm. But it's ultimately up to the parents to take control of that and make sure that their kids are complying so that they can protect themselves and other people. Mm-hmm. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel, HOA Hell. If you have any questions or comments, send them in. We like to read them. Until next time, have a wonderful day.